The company my father built over 32 years was worth $4.2 million the day he signed it over to my brother. And I was the one who built the spreadsheet that proved it. Let me back up. My name is Aubrey. I'm 31 years old. I have a master's degree in forensic accounting, 7 years of experience untangling other people's financial messes, and until 14 months ago, I had what I thought was a family. I was the quiet one. That's what they always called me. Not in a kind way, in the way people say quiet when they mean manageable. My brother Callum was the loud one, the charming one, the one who got caught shoplifting at 15, and my father laughed it off over dinner. I was the one who got a B+ in AP Calculus and was asked why it wasn't an A. I didn't grow up bitter about it. I want to be clear about that. I made peace with the hierarchy a long time ago. Callum was older, he was the son, and my father grew up in a house where that mattered. I understood the logic even if I didn't love it. What I never expected, what I genuinely could not have predicted, was that they would use me the way they used me for as long as they did, and then discard me the way you discard something that has served its purpose. My father owns a mid-sized logistics company. Nothing glamorous. He moves freight between distribution centers across the Midwest, has contracts with 4 regional grocery chains, employs about 60 people. For the last 7 years, I have been his head of finance. Not in title, my title was Financial Operations Coordinator, a name my father invented specifically so he wouldn't have to pay me what a CFO makes. But in practice, I built his accounting infrastructure from scratch. I caught a $380,000 vendor fraud in year 2 that would have sunk him. I restructured his debt during the supply chain crisis and kept the lights on when 3 of his competitors folded. I knew every contract, every liability, every account number. I knew where every dollar went. I also knew, and this is the part I kept quiet about, for reasons I am not proud of, that my father had been paying my brother a salary for 4 years, despite the fact that Callum showed up to the office maybe twice a week and spent most of his time at a lake house my father also paid for. I flagged it internally. My father told me it was a family matter and to mind my numbers. So, I minded my numbers. The annual review meeting happens every January. My father holds it at the main office. All department heads, the company attorney, the outside accountant we used for audits. I had run the financials for that meeting every year I'd worked there. I had them done 2 weeks early. I was proud of that report. It showed the company in the strongest position it had been in since I started. $4.2 million in net asset value, clean books, strong contracts going into the new year. The morning of the meeting, my father called me into his office before anyone else arrived. He was sitting behind his desk. Callum was standing by the window. My mother was there too, which was unusual. She almost never came into the office. She was looking at her hands. My father said, "We need to talk to you about some changes." I sat down. I thought he was going to tell me they were hiring an actual CFO. I had mentally rehearsed that conversation. I was ready to negotiate my title and salary or walk. He said, "I've decided to transition leadership of the company to your brother, effective the 1st of the month." I looked at Callum. Callum was looking out the window. I said, "Okay, what does that mean for my role?" My father cleared his throat. He said, "We're going to be restructuring the finance department. We've brought in an outside firm." I want to tell you that I kept my composure. I did, actually, on the outside. Inside, something very cold settled into my chest. I said, "You're replacing me." He didn't say yes. He said, "We think it's time for a fresh perspective." My mother still hadn't looked up. I asked when they had made this decision. My father said they had been discussing it for several months. Several months. While I was running his year-end close. While I was on the phone at 11 p.m. with his freight broker negotiating a contract renewal. While I was, without exaggerating, the reason his books were clean enough to be handed to my brother without embarrassment. I asked about severance. My father said the outside firm would be taking over my responsibilities immediately, and that because I was a transitioning family member rather than a traditional employee, standard severance didn't apply. I want you to understand what that phrase means. It means that for 7 years, when it was convenient, I was an employee. Now that they were done with me, I was family, specifically the kind of family that doesn't get paid out. I asked about the equity stake my father had verbally promised me 3 years earlier when I turned down a job offer from a firm in Chicago. He had told me in front of my mother that he would formalize a 5% ownership stake when the time was right. I had turned down $95,000 a year and full benefits for that promise. I had stayed. I had built the spreadsheet that proved the company was worth $4.2 million. 5% of $4.2 million is $210,000. My father looked at me with an expression I can only describe as genuinely puzzled and said, "That was never a formal agreement." I left the office. I did not cry. I did not slam any doors. I went to my desk. I picked up my personal laptop, my notebooks, and my coffee mug, the ceramic one my best friend had given me that said, "I have spreadsheets for this," and I walked out to my car. Then I sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes and tried to remember how to breathe. Here's what I knew in that parking lot. I knew every account number. I knew every contract. I knew the audit trail I had built, because I built it and I knew what it showed, including things I had flagged internally and been told to ignore. I also knew that I had, for the past 3 years, kept personal copies of every significant financial document I worked on. Not because I anticipated this moment. I am a forensic accountant. Keeping documentation is not paranoia. It is professional practice. Every engagement letter, every reconciliation report, every email chain where I'd raised a concern and been overruled, I had them all, backed up on a drive in my apartment. I drove home and I did not call anyone. I made coffee. I opened my laptop. I started reading. What I found over the next 3 weeks, not hacking, not anything illegal, just careful analysis of documents I had legitimately created and retained, was worse than I expected. The salary my father had been paying Callum for 4 years, a portion of it had been run through a vendor account, meaning it had been deducted as a business expense, specifically as payments to a logistics consulting firm that did not exist. I had flagged an anomaly in that account in year 3 and been told it was a legitimate contractor. I had noted the flag and moved on because I trusted my father. Looking at it now, with fresh eyes and no reason to give anyone the benefit of the doubt, it was not a legitimate contractor. It was my brother's lake house expenses, his car payments, and what appeared to be renovations on a condo that was registered in my mother's name. That's tax fraud. Not aggressive accounting. Not a gray area. Deducting personal expenses through a fictitious vendor is textbook tax fraud. My father had been doing it for at least 4 years, possibly longer, and I had been the one maintaining the books that contained the evidence. I also found the equity promise. My father had, in fact, sent me an email in the same week he made that verbal offer, an email I had completely forgotten about, in which he wrote, and I am paraphrasing because I will not quote a legal document in detail, that he intended to formalize a 5% ownership stake in recognition of my contributions to the company and that he would have the attorney draw up the paperwork in the new year. That email was 3 years old. The paperwork had never been drawn up, but the intent was documented in writing by him. An oral promise supported by written documentation is not nothing, especially in a dispute about ownership interest. I called an employment attorney. I did not call my family. I did not send a single text or email. For 3 weeks, while my father presumably believed I was either quietly accepting the situation or falling apart somewhere, I was building a case. The attorney told me I had 3 viable claims: breach of contract on the equity promise, unjust enrichment, 7 years of labor at below market compensation, justified by a promise that was never honored, and potentially, depending on how the fraud piece developed, a whistleblower protection claim that could significantly complicate any attempt to contest my other claims. She also told me something I wasn't expecting. She said, "You should know that if what you've described is accurate, you may have a legal obligation to report what you found." I had already known that. I had been sitting with it for 3 weeks. I am a forensic accountant. I have spent my career helping companies find fraud and correct it. I believe in that work. I believe the rules exist for a reason. I'd stayed quiet about the vendor account for 4 years because I trusted my father and because I told myself the amounts were small enough that maybe I was wrong. I was not wrong, and I was not going to be complicit in it any longer just because the person who did it shared my last name. I filed a report with the IRS whistleblower office. I want to be completely honest about this. I did not file it out of pure civic virtue. I filed it because I was angry, because I felt used, and because I knew that if I did not act from a position of documented compliance, I would be vulnerable if my father decided to come after me for anything related to the books I had maintained. But I also filed it because it was the right thing to do. Both of those things can be true. 3 days after I filed, I called my father. He answered on the second ring. He sounded normal. A little wary, maybe. I hadn't reached out since the meeting. He said, "Aubrey." I said, "I need you to know something. I've retained an attorney. I have documentation of the equity promise you made to me in writing 3 years ago, and I'm pursuing that claim. I've also filed a report with the IRS regarding the vendor account irregularis I flagged in year 3. I want to give you the opportunity to contact your own attorney before you receive anything official." There was a long silence. He said, "What did you do?" Not a question, a statement, the voice of a man who had just understood something. I said, "I documented my work. That's all I've ever done." I hung up. My phone started ringing 11 minutes later. My mother 4 times, Callum twice, my father once more. I let them all go to voicemail. I made dinner. I watched television. I slept better than I had in 3 weeks. The calls did not stop. Over the next 5 days, I received 43 attempts to reach me. Calls, texts, a voicemail from my mother in which she cried and said I was destroying the family, a text from Callum that I will not repeat here because it is not appropriate for any audience, and a hand-delivered letter from my father's attorney asking me to reconsider my position and suggesting that my claims had significant legal vulnerabilities. That last one I found genuinely funny. I forwarded it to my attorney. What happened over the following months was not fast, and it was not clean, and I want to be honest with you about that, because the way these stories sometimes get told, it sounds like justice arrives like a thunderclap. It doesn't. It arrives like water through stone, slow, patient, incremental. My equity claim went to mediation. My father's attorney argued that the email was informal and non-binding. My attorney argued that it established clear intent, was supported by my documented decision to forego a higher-paying position, and that the company had materially benefited from that decision. The mediator did not rule in my favor entirely, but the settlement we reached was $175,000. Not the full $210,000, but real money in my account for work I actually did. The IRS matter took longer. I won't pretend I have full visibility into what happened. Whistleblower cases don't come with a running update. What I know is that my father's company was audited. I know that because Callum, in a moment of stunning judgment, sent me a text message 6 months later that said, and I am quoting directly here, "I hope you're happy," which told me everything I needed to know about how that audit was going. I also know that the company did not transition to my brother's leadership on the timeline my father intended. The restructuring that was supposed to happen in February was still unresolved in June. I know this because one of my former colleagues reached out to ask if I knew of any open finance positions, and in the course of that conversation, told me the outside firm my father had brought in to replace me had already flagged significant issues in the books and was asking a lot of questions. I felt in that moment something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite sadness. Something more complicated than either. I had spent 7 years building something. It turned out to be evidence. I want to tell you what the hardest part was, because it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't the betrayal itself, though that was bad. It wasn't the months of legal process or the uncertainty or the weeks when I genuinely didn't know if I'd made the right decision. It wasn't even my mother's voicemail, though I've listened to it more times than I should have, trying to find something in it that sounded like the version of her I grew up with. The hardest part was the morning I woke up and realized I had stopped waiting for an apology. Not because I'd given up on it, Because I understood, finally, that there wasn't one coming, and that waiting for it had been the last way I was still letting them have power over me. I had spent 31 years being the quiet one, the manageable one, the one who flagged the anomaly and then accepted the answer and moved on. I had made myself small because I thought making myself small was what kept the peace. It didn't keep anything. It just made me easier to use. I have a new position now, an actual CFO role at a company that found me through a professional contact and didn't once ask me to accept below-market compensation in exchange for a promise. My title is on my business card. My salary is in writing. My equity stake, small but real, is in a signed contract that my attorney reviewed before I touched a pen. The Sunday after I accepted the offer, I drove past my father's office on my way to meet a friend for brunch. The parking lot was half empty in a way it hadn't been when I worked there. I don't know what that means exactly. I don't let myself think about it too long. I still have the coffee mug, the one that says, "I have spreadsheets for this." I have spreadsheets for everything now, and every single one of them has my name on it. I still think about the morning I sat in that parking lot and tried to remember how to breathe, not because it was the worst moment. It was actually one of the quieter ones, but it was the moment I understood clearly and without any room left for doubt that the story I had been telling myself for 7 years was not true. The story was, if I work hard enough, if I ask for little enough, if I make myself easy enough to keep around, it will be recognized. Eventually. That's what I believed. And for a long time, I confused that belief with patience, or with humility, or with being a good daughter. It wasn't any of those things. It was just fear, dressed up in the language of virtue. What happened to me followed a logic that I should have seen coming, and I say that not to blame myself, but because I think it matters to name it honestly. When you make yourself invisible so that other people are comfortable, you don't become trusted, you become taken for granted. My father didn't move against me because he hated me. He moved against me because after 7 years, he had genuinely stopped accounting for me as a person with her own interests. I had trained him to do that. Every time I flagged a concern and then accepted the answer without pushing back, I was teaching him that I was manageable. Every time I stayed late and didn't ask what it was worth, I was teaching him that my labor had no floor. The outcome wasn't a betrayal of the relationship. In a painful way, it was the logical conclusion of it. What I had to learn, and I don't say learn lightly because it cost me 7 years and $210,000, is that integrity is not the same as compliance. I had always thought of myself as an ethical person. I kept clean books. I flagged the problems I found, but there is a version of ethics that stops at your own desk, that says, I did my part right, while quietly looking away from what's wrong in the room around you. That's not integrity. That's convenience wearing integrity's clothes. Real honesty, the kind that holds up when something is actually at stake, required me to act on what I knew, even when the person responsible was my father, even when the consequences were going to fall on people I loved. That was the hardest part, not the legal process, not the months of uncertainty. The hardest part was accepting that doing the right thing was going to hurt someone I had spent my whole life trying not to hurt, and doing it anyway. And the third thing I came to understand, slowly, in the months after I filed and waited and didn't know how it would resolve, is that resilience is not toughness. I used to think being resilient meant not breaking, staying quiet in the meeting, walking out without slamming the door, not crying in the parking lot until 40 minutes after the fact. That's not resilience, that's suppression. Resilience is what I did in the weeks after, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a hard drive full of documents and a question I couldn't answer yet, and building something out of it anyway, moving forward without knowing whether it would work, trusting in the absence of any guarantee that the work I had done was real and that it would count for something. It did count, not perfectly, not completely, not without cost, but it counted. I have the signed contract on my desk. I have the coffee mug. I have my name on every spreadsheet. That's enough to start from.